Hello, friends. On July 20th, 1969, the lunar module of the Apollo 11 mission landed on the moon. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were in it. After the landing, Neil Armstrong tried to open the door to get down on the moon. It wasn't easy opening this door due to high pressure, but he successfully opened it after a little struggle. Then he tried to get down to the moon in his heavy spacesuit. The exit wasn't spacious, so by mistake, he hit the top and a piece of the lunar module broke off. Neither of them was aware of this because of the lack of air. The sound didn't travel. They didn't hear any sound. But this broken piece was very crucial. It was the ascent engine arming switch. Without this switch, their lunar module couldn't take off again and they couldn't return to Earth. Unaware of this, Neil Armstrong got out and stepped on the moon's surface. He became the first man to step on the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But did it actually happen? Today, more than 50 years later, many people refuse to believe that humans had gone to the moon. People cook up theories of their own to claim that the entire Apollo 11 mission was a farce put up by America, that they filmed the scenes on Earth and lied to the world. How else do you explain the flag fluttering without air? What's the truth to it? Come, let's try to understand this story in today's video. 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Friends, you'd be surprised to know the real reason why Apollo 11 mission was planned was a war. Specifically speaking, the Cold War, fought between America and the Soviet Union. Both countries were engaged in a space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union became the first country to launch the first artificial satellite. It was named Sputnik, and it was the first man-made object to be placed in Earth's orbit. The American government was shocked to see the Soviets getting ahead. Months later, in 1958, America launched their satellite as well. But 3 years later, in 1961, America got another shock. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was the first person to go to space. The Soviets beat America once again. 1 week later, the then President of America, John F. Kennedy, wrote a letter to the Vice President. Dated April 20th, 1961, he asked the Vice President how they could beat the Soviet Union. By putting a laboratory in space or by a trip around the moon. Are we working 24 hours a day on existing programs? If not, why not? Are we making the maximum effort? Asking if there was another space program that could be achieved quickly that would produce dramatic results and give them a lead in the race. He got the answer some days later because he soon realized that the next big step would be to send humans to the moon. On May 25, 1961, in his famous speech, he promised the world that he would send humans to the moon before the end of the decade. Not only this, he also promised to get the humans back on Earth safely. Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. For many, this was an unbelievable announcement. Friends, imagine 1961, there were no smartphones, no internet, there wasn't even GPS technology. The computers were so slow and old. In such times, he was promising to send humans to the moon. For this, over the next 5 years, he provided $7 to $9 billion in additional funding to the space program. The entire space agency was engaged in fulfilling this one aim. Mere months later, the tests began. First, they tested the rockets that would be used to leave the Earth. Then the heat shields of the command modules were tested. How much they'd be able to resist heat. Then the propulsion system of the service module. Between 1963 to 1967, many unmanned tests were carried out. The rockets didn't carry any humans during the tests. In February 1967, they planned the first manned tests. A test in which astronauts will go up to space in the rockets. This was the Apollo 1 mission. But during the tests on Earth on January 27, 1967, the cabin caught on fire and the 3 astronauts preparing to go to space died in the fire. After this painful event, NASA didn't lose courage. Instead, it continued further testing. Apollo 4, Apollo 5, and Apollo 6 were all unmanned missions for further testing. In October 1968, Apollo 7 mission was launched and once again they attempted to send humans to space. This was successful. Only 2 months later, in December 1968, Apollo 8 mission was launched in which 3 astronauts were sent near the moon. 3 months later, in March 1969, Apollo 9 mission was launched. In this, the lunar module was tested. The part of the spacecraft that was actually going to land on the moon. And 2 months after that, in May 1969, was the Apollo 10 mission. In this mission, 3 astronauts had to do almost everything for practice that was supposed to be done in Apollo 11 mission except actually landing on the moon. Look at the speed with which NASA was launching the missions one after the other. In the gap of 2 to 3 months, a new mission to test the next thing. Testing the rockets, spacecraft, going to the moon, and after all these tests, finally, on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 mission was launched. 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff, we have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff of Apollo 11. 3 astronauts were a part of this mission. 38-year-old Commander Neil Armstrong, he led this mission. The pilot of the command module, Michael Collins, and the pilot of the lunar module, Edwin Buzz Aldrin. These 3 names are inscribed in the pages of history. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become famous names, everyone knows them today. But Michael Collins isn't very popular. The reason for this is very interesting. I'll tell you later in this video. The spacecraft of this Apollo 11 mission had 3 main parts: the command module, service module, and the lunar module. The first 2 are collectively known as CSM, command and service module. They aim to detach the lunar module and have it land on the moon. And to return, the lunar module would have to be relaunched and attached to the CSM to enable the astronauts to return to Earth. To launch this spacecraft, a Saturn V rocket was to be used. Before the launch, the rocket was loaded with 1 million gallons of kerosene, liquid oxygen, and liquid hydrogen. The weight of this rocket was 3 million kilograms. With its help, the spacecraft reached Earth's orbit. It took less than 10 minutes to reach the orbit. Then they made about 1.5 revolutions around the Earth, after which they were given the permission from the mission control. The mission control was of course based on Earth. They communicated their permission to begin translunar injection, i.e. taking the spacecraft out of Earth's orbit and towards Moon's orbit. To leave Earth's orbit, the Saturn V rocket was used. This was the 3rd stage for the rocket. These events took place within 5 hours of the launch. But to actually reach the moon took several days. Astronauts waited in the spacecraft. They ate, slept, and took pictures of themselves and their surroundings on July 19, 1969. After traveling for almost 400,000 kilometers, the Apollo 11 spacecraft reached the moon's orbit. Here, it was supposed to be split into 2. The command and service module separated from the lunar module. Michael Collins was in the command module, nicknamed Columbia, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were in the lunar module, nicknamed the Eagle. The command and service module was tasked to remain in the moon's orbit. Only the lunar module was going to land on the moon. It meant that only Armstrong and Aldrin had the chance to step on the moon, not Michael Collins. Perhaps this is the reason why not many people know Michael Collins, even though he was part of the Apollo mission. Around 8 p.m., the lunar module was going to land on the moon. Exactly at 8:10 p.m., alarms went off, 12:01 and 12:02 alarms. Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin knew the meaning of this alarm. They asked the mission control what they ought to do next. Mission control told them to ignore it and keep going. Later, they figured out that 12:02 was a warning indicating that the processing system of the guidance computer of the Apollo was overloaded. But thankfully, the computer was designed in a way that the essential programs critical for the mission would continue despite being overloaded. The computer was installed with the program for automatic landing, which would automatically land the lunar module on the moon's surface. But at the height of 150 meters, Neil Armstrong took over control, changing the landing spot to avoid hazardous terrain. At 8:16 p.m., Buzz Aldrin checked the fuel indicator and found only 5% fuel remaining. Seeing the low level of fuel, the mission control initiated a countdown to decide whether they should land or abort the mission. Finally, literally at the last minute, with only 30 seconds remaining in this countdown, Neil Armstrong sent a radio message to Earth: "Roger, tranquility." The Eagle had successfully landed. Armstrong then put on his spacesuit, opened the door, and stepped onto the moon. This moment was watched by 650 million people on television. Buzz Aldrin followed him onto the moon's surface, and for the next 2.5 hours they collected samples of the moon's dust and rocks, took photographs, and set up several scientific instruments. Although the Cold War was a significant reason for this moon landing, the mission also carried several scientific objectives. They set up a television camera on the moon to transmit signals to Earth, took a device to measure solar winds reaching the moon, installed a device to send laser beams to Earth to compute the exact distance between Earth and moon, and had a passive seismometer to measure moonquakes. They collected 23 kilograms of rock and dust from the moon, left behind an American flag and a plate with an inscription commemorating their achievement. The lunar module had to remain on the moon for 21 hours, after which it had to take off again and attach to the Command and Service Module, CSM. But to go up, they needed propulsion, and for that, they needed an engine. However, both Armstrong and Aldrin were unaware that the switch to turn on the engine had broken off while they were getting out. When they came back to the lunar module, they realized what had happened and informed Mission Control about the damage, looking for a solution to resolve the situation. They came up with an interesting solution using a pen to complete the circuit and reignite the engine. Finally, the lunar module was reattached to the CSM and the 3 astronauts turned the spacecraft towards Earth. The command module safely descended the Earth's atmosphere and all 3 astronauts were alive and safe. They were then evacuated by rescue ships from the ocean. It was truly a miracle that they could return alive. It wasn't that the mission had gone exactly as planned. They had to face problems at almost every step. They successfully dealt with the problems and returned alive. After returning, the 3 astronauts were quarantined for 2 weeks as there was a risk of them carrying pathogens from the moon that could possibly wreak havoc on Earth. However, thankfully, nothing of the sort happened. The moon landing was celebrated worldwide and marked a significant technological achievement. Despite criticisms about the cost and priorities of the Apollo program, it had several hidden benefits, including advancements in technology like computer chips. NASA's plans to return to the moon with the Artemis program signify continued exploration and progress in space exploration.